just conscious that some colleagues are still joining us, but on behalf of the Apex board and Apex staff, can I welcome you all to our annual lecture. It's good to see so many old friends here and some new friends as well. There's a section in my script that says health and safety announcements, and then it says there are no health and safety announcements. No fire alarms are planned. If a fire breaks out, there's an exit that way, and if you count to 12 and then follow me that way, I'll get out a bit quicker. It's a wonderful place, it's a wonderful setting for our lecture. We're very pleased and privileged to be able to use it. A lot of things have been happening in Apex, and before I introduce our speaker and so on, I just want to point out some things. That today we've launched our annual report, and that's on the Apex website, and I ask you to go and look at the website for our annual report. And also the website itself, an enormous amount of work has gone into redesigning our all singing and dancing website. So please, if you have an opportunity, take a look at that. I'd also like to invite those who are social media friendly to be aware of the fact that if you hashtag Apex Lecture, you make a connection through social media. That is totally beyond me, as anyone who knows me. I'm bluffing at this point. But in a more conventional way, at the end of Professor McAra's presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So you might like to prepare something that you want to ask her or share with us. And we'll do that at the end. Another little point I wanted to make was that over the past few years, my predecessor, Mike McAra, has been the public face of Apex, especially as chair of this event. And I want to take this opportunity publicly to thank Mike for his contributions to Apex over a period of almost 10 years when he was on the board as a member and vice chair, and since 2010 as chair. In the past few years, he steered the organization through what was admittedly a very difficult time for us, and it had to cope with a lot of changes, not least the funding difficulties that all third sector organisations and public sector organisations are experiencing, but Mike's support was very good. I'll say just a little bit about the lecture. It follows its traditional format with our speaker followed by questions from the floor, as I said, and Fiona and Vary have got microphones, and they'll bring the microphones out, and I'll say more about that later. But this Apex lecture follows on from our tradition of speakers who add to the debate on justice in Scotland and promote debate and improvement in our particular field. We're delighted to welcome Professor Leslie McAra, who holds the chair of penology in the School of Law at the University of Edinburgh. And she is also a former dean of the University School of Law. Along with Professor Susan McPhee, she is co-director of the Edinburgh Youth Transition Study, which is the seminal longitudinal research on youth behaviour and its relevance to the study of crime and criminal behaviour. This research is constantly updated, and Leslie is giving the lecture on the back of the most recent findings, which will have an impact on prevention, punishment, rehabilitation and social change. So could I call on you to welcome Professor McAra.
Right, well, thank you very much for that very warm introduction, and can I also thank the organisers very much for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a great pleasure to be here in the historic Signet Library, and I'm particularly delighted to be able to address you in such history-making times. Not only does 2014 mark the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Kilbrandon Report, that very far-sighted and radical document which has framed a distinctly Scottish approach to matters of juvenile justice over the past 50 years, but also because 2014 is the year of the independence referendum. Whatever the outcome of the referendum, whether Scotland becomes independent or remains part of the Union, this constitutional moment gives us the opportunity to reflect on the values which we would wish to promulgate as a society, the manner in which we would wish to conduct our politics, and consequently the image that we as a nation would wish to project to the wider world. Now, criminologists as a breed have always had a somewhat uneasy relationship with politics and politicians. Our research tells us that those who seriously and persistently offend are amongst the most vulnerable, victimised and excluded groups of young people in our society. And we have weighty and persuasive evidence about the types of intervention that are more or less effective in addressing reconviction. In particular, we know that punitive interventions have very high failure rates which would be a major scandal in any other area of public policy, such as health or education. And from this knowledge, our impulse is often to argue for the depoliticisation of crime and punishment, to make crime control a matter of public health, or something best left to the experts. Have you ever heard a criminologist say, "Trust me, I'm a criminologist"? I don't know that always goes down well with the policymakers. However, we also recognise that crime control and penal practice go to the heart of contemporary democratic debates on the nature of citizenship and of inclusion, and that in speaking truth to power, our knowledge is, by its very essence, highly politicised. Consequently, in exploring the normative dimension of the power to punish, or interrogating the ways in which weak governments so often have recourse to more punitive modes of discourse, there is a need to generate more rather than less informed political debate. The title of my lecture this evening is Crime and Justice, a Vision for Modern Scotland. And I want to use this lecture to assess our progress as a nation in delivering justice for children and young people. And the particular benchmark that I'm going to apply is the definition of a democratic criminal justice system that is set out by Nicola Lacey in her groundbreaking book, The Prisoner's Dilemma, which formed the basis of our Hamlin lectures in 2007 and 2008. Now, according to Lacey, a democratic criminal justice system is characterised by its capacity to respond effectively and even-handedly to the harms and rights violations represented by criminal conduct, without resorting to measures which, in effect, negate the democratic membership and entitlement of offenders. Drawing on a critical analysis of policy developments post-devolution and on the findings from the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crime, I'm going to argue that within Scotland we have, in theory, the requisite infrastructure in the form of the children's hearing system to respond effectively and even-handedly to criminal conduct in ways that enhance the citizenship of young people who come into conflict with the law. But that in practice, the entrenched working cultures of agencies, both within the juvenile and adult justice systems, undermine their capacity to deliver justice for young people. Indeed, I will suggest that we cannot build a truly democratic society in which all our young people can flourish unless and until there is greater recognition, firstly, that criminal justice systems have somewhat pernicious tendencies to construct and reproduce, essentially curate their own client group, a tendency which persists over time, no matter the ideological framing of the government. And secondly, that in spite of everyone's best efforts, and for reasons beyond their control, criminal justice interventions would appear to have only a limited impact on offending behaviour over the longer term. Consequently, even greater political efforts are needed to align criminal justice with social justice, an ethical approach to policy making. Now, I'm going to begin the lecture with a brief contextual overview of the Edinburgh study. I will then benchmark Scottish policy developments since devolution using this Laceyan metric, and this will be followed by a more detailed review of our study findings as they relate to agency culture and factors which impact on pathways into and out of offending. The lecture will conclude with some reflections on an ethical approach to policy making, and more particularly by considering at what point, with whom, and by whom interventions underpinned by democratic values are best delivered. So that's the lecture. On then to the Edinburgh study. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Edinburgh study, it's a longitudinal programme of research and pathways into and out of offending for a cohort of around 4,300 young people who started secondary school in the city of Edinburgh in 1998. It's been funded by grants from the Economic and Social Research Council, the Nuffield Foundation and the Scottish Government. We have multiple data sources about all members of the cohort, including self-report questionnaires, semi-structured interviews at age 13 and 18, data from official records such as schools, social work, the reporters of the Children's Hearing System, and criminal conviction data. And finally, we have built a geographic information system based on police-recorded crime and census data to enable us to understand the dynamics of the neighbourhoods in which young people live. The most recent phase of the study has been especially focused on criminal justice careers and their impact on desistance from offending. And I'm delighted that my partner in crime, Susan McVie, is sitting on the front row here tonight. And all of this work is that work that we have done together over many, many years. Importantly, our cohort has grown to maturity over the course of the devolved settlement in Scotland. Born in the mid-1980s, they reached the age of criminal responsibility in the 1990s. They reached the peak age of self-reported offending, around 14 to 15 in our cohort, post-devolution during the first of the Labour Liberal Democratic Coalition administrations. And they entered full adulthood in the first years of the SNP minority administration. The longitudinal nature of the study, with data from over 15 years of fieldwork, places the research team in a unique position to observe the individual developmental implications of the evolving cultural and political dynamics of devolution, something that no other study has. And so this then takes me neatly onto the first substantive part of the lecture, benchmarking these very dynamics which form the backdrop to the lives of the cohort. Prior to devolution, Scottish criminal justice policy was predominantly under the control of penal elites, including networks of civil servants, the judiciary, and sometimes senior academics. Comparative research shows that elite control over criminal justice often results in more benign and welfarist approaches to matters of crime and punishment. This is seen, for example, in Spain in the post-Franco years. It's exactly the same thing happened. Now, in the immediate aftermath of devolution, crime and punishment were utilised in a much more self-conscious and populist way by the newly established Scottish government. The post-devolution years saw a major shift away from the former predominantly welfarist values to a policy portfolio framed by a more competing and complex set of principles, actuarial, punitive and restorative, together with some vestiges of penal welfarism. Rights talk also permeated the system with the installation of the ECHR within Scots law. And all of this was overlaid by the lexicon of new public management, with the attempt to hold criminal justice institutions more firmly to account via target setting and the requirements to develop corporate plans linked to key performance indicators. Youth crime and antisocial behaviour in particular formed a centrepiece of governance, with much the most punitive modes of discourse being linked to ways of tackling the behaviour of young persistent offenders. The populist and punitive dimensions of the policy frame were predicated on an exclusionary set of practices, borrowed mostly from development south of the border in England. And this really forms a Durkheimian case study in how to build social solidarity through the othering of offenders. Now, since 2007, there has been a gradual transformation in the ways in which crime and punishment have been mobilised in the service of political strategy. Here they have been much more closely tied to a social democratic and preventative agenda, with the SNP administrations using the research evidence to build the intellectual case for what they term compassionate justice, a distinctively Scottish approach, they claim, to matters of crime and punishment. And on this slide, I've put an extract from the Strategy for Justice in Scotland, which states, "Our vision is of a justice system that contributes positively to a flourishing Scotland, helping to create an inclusive and respectful society in which all people and communities live in safety and security." Now, who wouldn't want to live somewhere like that? So two very different ideological approaches to polity building. Did either result in greater democracy within criminal justice? Well, taking the Labour Liberal Democratic Coalition efforts first. The evidence suggests that most of the transformations made by the first post-devolutionary coalition government were of limited effect. The government attempted to reach out to and service more explicitly via the criminal justice agenda a set of newly invoked audiences, including the wider public, victims of crime and communities. It constructed over 100 new institutions to deal with criminal justice matters, a massive hyper-institutionalization. And it evolved new conduits for communicating with its key audiences, including the use of the petition committee within the Parliament and a raft of formal public consultations, the results of which were intended to shape policy imperatives. However, all of this activity, I would suggest, resulted in increased political and ministerial command and control over the system, quite centralised control. It was also predicated on a somewhat narrow conception of its specified audiences, with ministers speaking to the morally deserving victim, conveniently forgetting that victims and offenders are often overlapping groups, of the law-abiding public and an already mobilised community, with communities being simultaneously and somewhat paradoxically invoked as both a mode, site, but also an effect of governance. This was accompanied by a major loss of expertise as academics were increasingly supplanted by survey companies as purveyors of criminological knowledge to government. Turning then to phase 2 in the SNP administration, well, here the government attempted to correct some of the more pernicious aspects of the former administration through a rationalisation of bureaucracy and a reconstruction of the channels of communication. And this phase has seen a major reduction in offence referrals to the children's hearing system, around about an 82% reduction, and a very welcome drop in the number of young people who are in young offenders institutions, around about a 48% drop. But despite an overt commitment to social democracy, a number of factors have confounded some of their aspirations in this regard. In centralising and simplifying in an effort to create greater efficiency, the government has arguably undermined local democracy and may have inadvertently created competing power bases, the sites of future conflict, as with the recent controversies over the activities of the single national police force. It's a real irony that devolution seems now to be resulting in increased centralisation. It's a kind of Weberian dynamic, the rationalisation of bureaucracy. And finally, a very interesting development has been the increasing challenges posed by the human rights framework and decisions made by the UK Supreme Court overturning local decisions which have become caught up in a row about self-determination. So in terms of our report card on the democratic nature of Scottish criminal justice, the assessment for both sets of administration would have to be could do better. However, there are some further things that I want to say about key continuities which make the position slightly worse. There are certain key continuities across the post-devolution landscape which neither set of administrations has had the confidence to fully address. That in Scotland we continue to defy international human rights standards by retaining age 8 as the age of criminal responsibility. That is a national disgrace. And by routinely processing older children aged 16 and 17 in the adult criminal justice system. And this has been accompanied by the inexorable rise of the prison population, which until very recently has defied every effort by politicians to stem or reduce it. But there are some green shoots of hope here. If you look a very small picture on the bottom of this slide, you'll see that this is actually diminishing now, and this is very, very welcome and very long overdue. So that's an overview of policy, and I want to turn to the Edinburgh study findings. And here I'm going to show you some evidence which indicates that there has been a degree of dissonance between criminal justice as a political strategy and the performance or day-to-day practices of the institutions which make up the juvenile and adult criminal justice system in Scotland. Indeed, far from institutional performance reflecting the variant phases of policy just described, from the more punitive to the more integrative, the period of devolution indicates strong continuities in penal practice. What we see happening is that the criminal justice system served to construct, nurture and reproduce its own client base, a process which is profoundly anti-democratic in both ethos and outcome. Okay. Now, the first piece of evidence relates to continuities in policing practices. This table shows the results of regression modelling exploring factors which best predict being warned or charged by the police at 3 different times: immediately prior to devolution in 1998, in 2003 during the Labour Liberal Democratic coalition years, and in 2009 during the SNP administration. A similar dynamic is evident in each temporal sequence. And as you can see, I hope, and as you would expect, Involvement in serious offending, violence here, is strongly predictive of warnings and charges. That's what you would expect. However, even when controlling for this, the evidence indicates that the police disproportionately focus attention on those from socially deprived neighbourhoods and those available for policing as a consequence of their routine activities. But much the strongest predictor of warning and charges is having been warned or charged in the previous year. At age 11 and 12, the usual suspects had around 6.5 times greater odds of being warned or charged than those caught for similar levels of violence but who had no such police history, and around 10 times greater odds of being charged at ages 16 and 17 and in early adulthood at ages 21 to 22. Now, this recycling of the usual suspects is further evidence when the results of Sweep 7 analysis are looked at in more detail. And this is the most recent fieldwork that we completed in 2011. I just want to flip through a couple of slides here to there. Now, as part of Sweep 7, we tracked the criminal justice and self-reported offending careers of two matched groups. The early cases, those with an offence referral to the children's hearing system by age 12, and an early control group, the early matches on this slide, who had no contact with any agency of juvenile justice at all. And the matching was done over a series of variables, including serious offending and violence. Effectively, other than contact with the system, there were no differences between the two groups. Now, having a large cohort like this allows for this kind of quasi-experimental analysis to be done. It's very robust and it's very powerful. Now, if we look first at the subsequent self-reported offending trajectories of these groups, there is no difference between them at any study sweep. Essentially, both groups exhibit a desisting trajectory from age 14, the peak age of offending, right through to almost virtually stopping by age 23. There is no difference between them in terms of their self-report. But there is a major dissonance between the groups in terms of their criminal justice careers. The early cases, which are the red blocks on these different slides, and the yellow ones are the early matches, the early cases were significantly more likely to be warned or charged by the police in subsequent years, to be referred to the reporter, to the children's hearing system, to be charged and brought to court for an offence in the adult criminal justice system. Indeed, as you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide, 64% of the early cases had a conviction in the adult courts by age 24, as contrasted with just 27% of the early matches, and 42% were in custody, as compared with just 9% of the matches, even although their self-reported offending behaviour is exactly the same. What our findings show is that certain groups become the focus of the criminological gaze, a gaze which serves to have only a very limited, if any, impact on offending in the longer term. Now, if we look more widely at the cohort as a whole, the evidence indicates that the groups who become the focus of this agency attention tend to come from the most vulnerable and dispossessed neighbourhoods in Edinburgh. And one of the easiest ways to demonstrate this is via the maps that we created from our geographic information system. And this highlights the links between institutional exclusionary practices and poverty. Now, this first map shows is a map of deprivation across Edinburgh based on census data. And the darker the shading, the more intense is the level of poverty. And you'll notice, I hope, on this, that there is a kind of pentagon shape emerging on this map. And this is a pentagon shape that is reproduced in all the maps I'm just going to flip through now very quickly. So poverty is concentrated in this pentagon, as are police-recorded violent crimes. Equally, you see the same pattern emerging. Incivilities observed by our cohort, such as intensive amounts of graffiti, vandalism or burnt-out cars are again concentrated in these areas, as is the pattern of school exclusion amongst the cohort. This is rather sort of blue petery circles I've put on top of this map. I'm not very good at doing these maps. And these show the top 10 most excluding schools across Edinburgh. And again, they're linked to the areas of greatest poverty. And finally, and most significantly, youngsters with experience of detention also cluster in these areas. Indeed, a quarter of all those who've been in secure care or imprisoned, or both, come from only a few streets in this estate down there where that black mark is with a white round it, to the southwest of the city. That is where a quarter of all those who have been in secure care or in prison come from. Now, the final nailing piece of evidence I want to show you, which demonstrates how institutions reproduce their own client base, drawing from the most poor and dispossessed, comes from a series of models exploring the factors which best predict which youngsters known to the hearing system by age 12 end up in custody by age 24. This table includes only the variables that remain significant in the final model. Now, as might be expected, having an early history of violence remains predictive of later custody when other factors are held constant. You would expect that. However, even when controlling for this, boys had 3.5 times greater odds of being in detention than girls. Similarly, those who had experienced any form of residential care by their 12th birthdays had 4 times greater odds of detention than those with no such history, as did those with experience of school exclusion. And school exclusion has the biggest effect size in this model. What is interesting about the model is that once school exclusion is controlled for, all measures of social deprivation fall out. However, school exclusion is not in itself a neutral process, and when factors implicated in school exclusion are interrogated, poverty re-emerges. Effectively, within the first model, exclusion is functioning as a proxy measure for poverty. This table on the right shows the results of regression modelling exploring factors predicting school exclusion at age 15. This is the most prolific age of exclusion. And as can be seen from the model, high volume of bad behaviour remains predictive of exclusion when other factors are held constant. That's what you would expect. However, even when controlling for this, youngsters living in the most deprived neighbourhoods had over twice the odds of being excluded from school than their more affluent counterparts. Those living in single-parent or non-parental care households had significantly greater odds of exclusion than those living with 2 parents, either birth parents or step-parents. However, as with detention, the variable with the largest effect size in the model is early experience of exclusion. As indicated on the table, exclusion in the first year of secondary education leads to a repeat cycle in later years, accompanied by a troublemaker reputation. Taken together, these models and these broader findings are suggestive of a pathway into imprisonment, beginning in poverty and shaped along the way by labelling, stigmatisation and multiple instances of exclusion. A pathway which in practice has limited impact on reoffending, but one which negates the democratic membership and entitlements of these young people. On then to the final part of this lecture. Given that the juvenile and adult criminal justice systems appear to have limited impact on reoffending as opposed to reconviction rates, what do our findings then suggest about the key factors which drive desistance from offending, which could form the focus of a more democratic approach to matters of justice? Okay. Well, here I want to show you some findings that Susan and I are just working on just now. And these are trajectory analysis which shows variant self-reported serious offending pathways. Now, as you can see, we found in the cohort around 5 main groups, what we've termed a non-offender group, which is the largest of the groupings, which comprises around about half of the cohort. And this is the blue line at the bottom of this slide here. Now, this is not to suggest that this group were complete angels, because almost every member of the cohort admitted to some form of petty offending during the life of the study. Petty offending was very normal. It was a normal part of development. We also found a chronic group, which is the red group at the top of the slide there, whose probability of involvement in serious offending was relatively high at each of the 6 sweeps of the study represented here, although diminishing over the last few years. We also found an early desister group, whose probability of offending was high in the early study years, but then dramatically fell, which is our yellow line on the picture here. And then finally, a later onset group whose probability of serious offending began to rise significantly over the teenage years and continued into the adult years, the green line on this slide here. And finally, a mid-teen group, mid-teen limited group is a purple line, which is a kind of adolescent limited offending, whose offending rose significantly between 13 and 15 and then fell in subsequent years. As you can see from the slide, all groups, other than the later onset group, all offending groups, significantly decreased their involvement, their probability of involvement into offending to a greater or lesser extent from ages 15 to 17. There is, apart from the green line, there is a general downward trajectory. So Susan and I have been doing some analysis exploring the factors which drive this particular pattern. Now, on this slide here, I've set out some of the key differences we found between the 3 desisting groups as contrasted with that later onset group whose offending is rising between the ages of 15 and 17. Now, as indicated on the slide, this desisting pathway for each of the 3 desister groups was promoted by transformations in key relationships. The desisting groups experienced less conflict with parents and or their caregivers, less conflict with peers, less bullying from peers, and they became involved in longer-term, more sustained romantic relationships. By contrast with the later onset group, intrafamilial conflict remained high, added experience of bullying, and swift turnover of romantic relationships. A desisting trajectory was also promoted by reductions in stressful events such as close family members dying or parental divorce, with a concomitant decrease in self-harming behaviours. Desistance was additionally accompanied by increases in self-esteem and feelings of self-worth, and an increase in self-control. Youngsters essentially became less impulsive, whilst there was no change in the later onset group. Reductions in victimisation also presaged a desisting pathway, in contrast to the later onset group who experienced significantly elevated rates of crime victimisation, especially victimisation from violence. And finally, hanging around the streets and socialising with friends who were involved in offending also diminished, as one might expect for the desister group over this time frame, in contrast to the later onset group. Taken as a whole, these findings indicate that the context of desistance is one in which the young person has greater control in terms of his or her capacity to negotiate and build key relationships in a positive and sustained way, and one in which many of the core vulnerabilities strongly linked to serious offending are diminished. Now, in keeping with other research on desistance, it's clear from the trajectory analysis that desistance is a process. It's not a single event, and it takes place over years, not months nor days, and that's why longitudinal research is really, really important, why single case study evaluations do not tell you enough about desistance. And there are very many challenges for young people in sustaining a desister pathway. Now, in order to evidence this, I want finally to turn to some of our qualitative data. As I said earlier, we undertook semi-structured interviews at age 13 and 18 with subsamples of the cohort. Now, at age 18, these included some young people who'd been involved in serious offending, and a specific aim of these interviews was to explore the desister pathway. We know from this interview data, as well as from our quantitative data, that for many young people, involvement in offending begins as a means of gaining status and a sense of belonging within their peer groups. That a pattern of offending is sustained, where rewards of an offender identity continue to outweigh the risks, and that such identities are only left behind when other modes of attaining status become available or are perceived as more desirable. Involvement with the juvenile justice and adult justice systems makes that process of desistance and makes that process of identity construction far more difficult. So at age 13, youngsters had very strong sense of agency and didn't perceive that they were under pressure to become involved in offending. Here are some typical quotes. "Nobody forces me to do stuff. It's my choice. There's nobody really to pressurise me. If they ask me, it depends if I want to." However, by age 18, there was far greater realism about the longer-term influence of peers and the difficulties of moving on. As one of the boys said, "Once you're involved, you can never really pull yourself away from it. There's always a tie. You can't really disconnect. But at the same time, some people never forget, so you've got to watch yourself, even if you're trying to move on, because a lot of people are still in gangs. They'll remember you." And a second boy said, "If I'm uptown or somewhere and I'm just walking along the road and I see people fighting and I look and it's somebody that I've known from years ago, it's one of these things. It's just instinctive to go and help them because they've done it for me in the past. And that's how a lot of the time you get big fights breaking out because it's a sort of friends thing." Importantly, those who continue to be involved in serious offending in the later teenage years appear to be stuck in certain discursive pathways. Offending at age 13 is often justified on the grounds of sticking up for family and friends, self-defence, or meting out revenge. And similar themes also came out at age 18. In fact, our 18-year-olds sounded pretty much like 13-year-olds. And here are some examples of this. So at 13, example of self-defense. It was an older guy and he started calling me names, so I went to hit him. Every man for himself, right? And he dodged and he took out a knife and slashed my ankle. I was sure I hit him hard. His mouth was all bloody and you could see the wee white bits. Standing up for friends and family. So my sister came crying to me, so I went and got my mate, because there was like two of them, and they could have battered me, because one had a pole and one had a stone. So I bagged the pole off him, and then I punched him right in the face and gave him a bust lip. And then revenge, a girl. People have taken jewellery and stuff. It's usually people who don't care much, and you really, really want to hurt them a lot. Then the whole threatening people with knives and stuff comes out. If they deliberately destroyed it or anything, then I'd get back at them. And then we move on to age 18. Similar sorts of discourses emerge. So this is a boy. This is age 18. I was uptown and he hit my friend. This person, I never even knew him. And they started fighting and he was hitting my friend. And my friend fell. And as soon as my friend fell, I just went running and kicked him right in the jaw. And his jaws just went like that and the boy fell flat. He just collapsed and I mind running because I thought he was dead. Honest, I thought the boy just collapsed and we were only young. Looking at him, I was just like, what have I done? I ran away and left him. And then a girl at age 18. One girl started phoning me and hurling abuse down the phone, so my pal had to phone her, and she was hurling abuse back. I'd never met her in my life, but she jumped my wee sister because she didn't like me. But she'd never met me either. She just argued with me on the phone. I was going to kill her there. I would have ripped her head off. I've still not seen her in my life. Well, I've seen her, but she always runs away. Who could blame her? So those are some of the challenges in sustaining a non-offender identity. On then to some concluding thoughts. The question I set out at the beginning were, at what point, with whom, and by whom are services best delivered to enhance justice for vulnerable young people? At what point? Well, our findings suggest there's a need for what Susan and I call gerfok as much as gerfek, which is getting it right for older children. We need to resource services which can support young people as they negotiate transitions in the early, mid and late teenage years, transitions into and out of secondary education, into and out of care, into and out of key relationships, and into and out of risky encounters. And I think that the Children and Young Persons Scotland Act has the potential to help out in this regard. With whom to intervene? The findings indicate that generic services are needed to support all young people in communities with heavy concentrations of poverty and social adversities. Given that early contact with agencies runs the risks of labelling and stigmatising, universal provision within these locales would have a strong payoff. There is also a need to intervene to tackle institutional working cultures and support more reflexive practice on the part of key professionals, both within schools and within the wider juvenile and adult systems. And finally, by whom? The findings would suggest that formal agencies of juvenile and adult justice are rather blunt instruments for supporting the process of desistance from offending, and that such support is best delivered through health services, schools, youth work, community education, many of you in this room today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the paper, it is now 50 years since the publication of the Kilbrandon report. In that report, the committee wrote, if society's present concern is to find practical expression in a more discriminating machinery for intervention, it must be recognised that society's own responsibilities towards the children concerned will be correspondingly increased, and that this will make commensurate demands on the nation's resources. Scottish politics post-devolution has been characterised too often by failed attempts to respond effectively to crime in ways that enhance the democratic membership of offenders. As we stand on the threshold of a transformed constitutional settlement, we have a major opportunity to promulgate to the world a vision of juvenile justice in which improvements to the life chances of our most vulnerable young people become everyone's responsibility. Our time is now. Thank you very much.
I've heard Leslie speak on a number of occasions, and the two thoughts I don't think she'll ever have is, did I make the point I wanted to make and did I evidence it? And she always makes a point and she always evidences. Thank you very much, Leslie. That was really, I think, quite inspirational. And I hope, in some ways, maybe provocative in terms of the thoughts we should have. As an old social worker, a very old social worker, any lecture that begins with a mention of Kilbrandon has me inside from day one. And there were little things there, and others are going to talk about it later, but I just thought the working culture of agencies in the week of Rotherham, how much that's going to come under scrutiny for all of us in the future. And the talk about exclusion, which actually doesn't sound an awful thing, does it? Just a wee bit, just go over there for a minute. And the huge damage in that, and I'm really proud of the fact that Apex is working with colleagues in education. We've been there in Fife for a long time, where there's a fair bit of insight into this, and now in Dundee and in Moray, and some of you may contribute to that. So we're now coming to the part in the lecture where you'll have an opportunity to communicate in, and Leslie will be happy, I'm saying she'll be happy, will be happy to try and respond to the questions or the points you want to make. That's one of the ways of communicating. Can I remind you again, the other way to communicate with us is to tweet #ApexLecture. But Vary at the front and Fiona at the back, no, Fiona at the front and Vary at the back have got the roving mics. And as you consider the point of the question, could I ask you to give us your name and the agency or the area of work you're in? I think that would be helpful. And I'd like to invite you to put up your hand for the first question. At the front.
You did mention what most people would regard as the immediate causes of offending, which are alcohol, misuse of drugs, and mental health. And I wonder if you can relate these immediate causes to the study you're making of the underlying causes.
Okay. Right, do you want me to answer that now? Right, okay. Well, mental health is obviously really important, and one of the things that I mentioned looking at desistor pathways was self-harming behaviours, and how self-harming behaviours are very closely aligned with serious offending, and particularly violent offending. A very strong correlation, particularly amongst the young women who get involved in violence. A lot of cutting, a lot of self-harm, and so therefore mental health is intertwined with offending behaviour. Alcohol and drugs, it's not so much that alcohol and drugs are necessarily the cause of offending. There are things that go along with offending. So our offenders are often heavy drug users, they're often heavy alcohol users, and that alcohol, the context of offending in certain times is fueled by drugs and alcohol, but the actual nature of an offender's career is not necessarily driven by the alcohol and the drugs. It's one of the things that goes on as a situational aspect of offending, which can lead to certain contexts and situations becoming much worse, as we know that most homicides in Scotland are undertaken in the context of drink, drugs, or both.
Another question? Fiona again.
Stuart Bain from Fife Council, Human Resources. Leslie, I wonder, I know at the moment that we're looking at the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act and changing the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, and also the Protection of Vulnerable Groups Act. And I just wondered what advice you would offer to the people doing those reviews in terms of the information that employers should get about conviction information.
Yeah, okay. I think I feel quite strongly about, I've been involved with Maggie Mellon and others, Bruce Adamson from the Human Rights Commission, and campaigning for transformations in the law about the disclosure of childhood offences. And it is concerning that there have been, I think, very pleased that there have been transformations in the law such that most offences that are admitted through a children's hearing system now count as alternatives to prosecution rather than as convictions. But of course there are certain serious offences that continue to count as convictions and will be disclosable potentially up to age 40. Now, we have a system in Scotland, the children's hearing system, which is meant to be about decriminalising young people. And the continued disclosure of these kind of offences to employers is one way in which we consistently sustain a criminalising tendency. And often, in the past, it was often the case that the young people who came before the children's hearing system and admitted to offences actually didn't appreciate the consequences of that, which is actually not good at all. So I would be very keen, that we raise the age of criminal responsibility, because even though the age of prosecution is age 12, the age of criminal responsibility is 8, and therefore admitted offences from 8 to 12 will count in this context. We would like to raise the age of criminal responsibility and make sure that any childhood transgressions, although one can keep a quiet watching aspect on this, that after a certain time that these should be expended and should not continue to haunt young people through their early adult, late adulthood.
Thank you.
Leslie, thank you for your speech. My name is Gerard McAnina. I've been a children's panel member for 20 years. During that time, I've seen a huge change in the type of referrals that come to the children's hearing system. 20 years ago, when I was about 12 and I started, it was a lot of offence cases. Now, very, very rarely see offence cases, which I'm sure we'll agree is the right thing. You should be dealt with out with the hearing system, if at all possible. But what I wondered was, in the last 20 years, clearly we're getting something right, but we're still seeing a lot of people going into prison, and that's not kind of coming down at the same rate. What needs to change so that in 20 years' time, yourself or someone else is not here given the exact same stats?
So that young people ending up in prison. Yes. Currently, we have been implemented across Scotland the whole system approach to dealing with young people who are involved in offending. If that whole system approach were properly implemented, and I mean, by when I say properly implemented, I mean properly resourced, had enough key workers there working within it, and there were appropriate and well-resourced mechanisms for diverting young people away from formal measures wherever possible. If that were to work, and if it were properly resourced and it had the right people in it, then I think that would have the potential to lead to major reductions in the use of custody. There is always the need for custody or detention for a very small number of young people who are at a serious risk to others. There's always that kind of need. But for the vast majority of young people, custody is the worst thing that can happen, and the one thing that's more likely to not lead them to transforming their behaviour than others and diminishes their life chances. So I think my general feeling is that the whole system approach is one of the ways in which one might go. But it does need to be properly resourced. And this is one of the things I think that is a frustration when Susan and I are doing stuff on the Edinburgh study, how often we hear about wonderful things that are happening on the ground or wonderful interventions that then either don't carry on because there's not enough resource there, or people are constantly having to apply for more money to keep something going, or when things are not appropriately resourced. Most of what works in terms of when we do have a youngster coming in front of an official system, the thing that really works is a very good relationship with a key worker, someone who is consistently there for that young person. What the system needs is general social work and good workers. That's what it needs. And if that could be resourced, I think that would make a big difference.
Just here. Fiona, can you... Sorry, Barry's on her way. Can you wave your hand again? Because sorry, thanks.
David Orr from the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice. It's a question, you said at the start about criminologists being quite circumspect when it comes to politics. And one of the things that always strikes me, in hearing you talk on the Edinburgh study is that there's quite a strong message politically at the heart of it around universalism, for example. I'm wondering at what stage do practitioners, politicians, others in the field need to be thinking about alternatives. So, for example, a citizen's basic income is something that's on the agenda for different people about tackling the stigma of welfare and I guess avoiding some of the kind of stigmas and label that you talk about in relation to the criminal justice system. So do practitioners in the field need to open up their kind of this is turning into quite a ramble, but do they need to think more broadly about what needs to be done to tackle social exclusion? Yeah. So I mean, I guess engage with something that would fundamentally be seen as more political about welfare rights and the economy.
Yeah, no, I mean, the one thing that our findings show very strongly is that resource should be put into social transformation, economic regeneration, community schools, working in an area with investing it with huge amount of resource rather than targeting. I think that's what we show. And I think that if one were able to have, I mean, we say this a lot, and governments know that. I mean, the frustrating thing is that governments know this. We've known, I mean, one of the things about the Edinburgh studies, we've known some of these findings. We're repeating what others have found before us, and yet nobody seems to listen. That the most cost-effective way, actually, of tackling crime is not to pour more and more money into new prisons, not to pour more and more money into criminal justice, but actually to pour more and more money into social justice responses and social and community-based responses in terms of the social justice within communities. Community schools, education, those are the things that I think that, if were properly resourced, would make a tremendous difference. It's very difficult for governments because there is a media which is always ready to leap down their throats if they seem to be soft on crime. And I think some of the kind of messages that government needs to kind of somehow transform the discourse within which juvenile justice and adult justice is discussed. It's what academics have been trying to do, but politicians also need to follow that lead. Many of the things that we talk about, the sort of soft approaches to criminal justice, what the newspapers would view as soft, are actually very strong ways of tackling crime. They're actually the most robust ways of tackling crime. And somehow we've allowed the media to grab hold of the discourse, which we should actually be leading. And so I think transformations in the way in which we talk about these problems would actually help a lot. I mean, we had, Susan and I, once the Daily Mail had a league table of academics who state the bleeding obvious, and Susan and I came 7th out of 22. We're a bit cross about not being first. And it was about the fact that, you know, that if you're a Ned at school, then you're going to end up in prison. And you think, well, if that is so bleeding obvious, why haven't we done anything about it?
I think if you're on a Daily Mail hit list, that's probably the place to be. Maggie.
Hi, Maggie Mellon. I was going to ask you, Leslie, about the terrible impact that retention and disclosure of offences has on children. However, that question having been asked, I'm going to ask you another leading question, which is there's been a lot of emphasis recently and a lot of claims made for early years policy, and about which, a lot of which I think seems to imply or based on the fact that it's parents who damage their children and turn them into, or set them on a career for offending. And in fact, that is one of the claims that's been made, that an early intervention would solve. But your research seems to imply that it's more society and social impacts that turn children into offenders from adolescent behaviour. So can you comment on that, and whether you think resources would be better expended on early years or on the universal progressive measures that you suggest?
It depends, I suppose, what government is hoping to get out of early years intervention. When early years intervention is seen as a way of diminishing risk of offending in later years, and that is the wrong approach to take, because it's very, very difficult to predict from a young age those young people who are going to become involved in offending. Everybody thinks that they know who all the offenders are, and everybody thinks that you can tell from a young age the very problem families and the ones who are going on, you know, it seems to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in actual fact, it's actually very difficult. And one of the trajectory modelling we shows that there is actually a late onset group in terms of self-reported offending who you would never have picked up from the very, very early years. And so because of that, because so much offending is hidden, you can't actually effectively target young people from the early years to stop future offending. And if you do target young people from the early years, you run the risk of stigmatizing and labeling, which has deleterious effects, as our study findings have shown. The big emphasis on early years does have a danger of diminishing efforts to focus on the mid-teenage years, and some of those key transitions from primary into secondary education is a key transition. From leaving care into and out of care is a key transitional moment. And those are areas which require robust resourcing as much as the early years. And I think, in general terms, if you're having early years intervention, if you have whole communities which there are concentrations of poverty, concentrations of social exclusion, concentrations of poor housing, concentrations of incivilities, if you put universal support into that, that will actually have a much better payoff for everyone in that community than it would be if you're just targeting on specific individuals.
Thank you. We've just got one more question, time for one more question.
Okay. Judith Thompson from Skills for Justice, and predictably, it was hello?
Yeah.
It was a really fascinating lecture and a lovely granular look at patterns of offending and desistance. I just wondered, were there any particular approaches or skills in terms of social work and relationships that seemed to be better or less good at encouraging young people and older people to desist?
Yeah. Okay, yes. Though I haven't presented this finding this evening, as I said a bit earlier, involvement, we found generally that involvement, the more deeper someone gets sucked into the system, the more that has a sort of diminishing impact on their capacity to desist from offending. But what we did find was that special relationships between a key worker and a young offender was the thing that actually could make a difference. As I said, there has to be continuity in who that person is. There has to be a warmth and quality to that relationship where that person acts as an advocate for the young person. So this is not about special programs. This is about personal relationships. And that's why, old-fashioned social work, casework, is the thing that we should really be valuing. Social workers should be our most important resource here. And so that kind of relationship is the one thing that actually can make a difference to that young person's life. But crucially, you have to see the young person in their wider social context. Much of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of desistance shows it's all about the kind of the interpersonal relationships in the young person's immediate social sphere that make a big difference. And therefore, this key worker has to be able to help that young person negotiate those kind of relationships in ways that are supportive of a desister trajectory. And if you have a good relationship, but it's in the context in which there is a lack of economic opportunity and no resources for that young person to gain status in any other way than in offending, then any kind of relationship, however good it is, will not work. So it has to be excellent workers, well-resourced, but in the context of meaningful opportunity, meaningful stakes in society for our most vulnerable young people.
Leslie, thanks for that, and thanks to you for the questions that you've posed. If there was something you were bursting to say, hashtag Apex Lecture. We've now come to the close of our event. I'm going to invite Alan Staff, the Apex Chief Executive, to make a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Chair. I've seldom heard the bleeding obvious put across quite so well. So thank you, Leslie. About 8 years ago now, some folk in Apex and a very far-sighted high school in Dunfermline looked at the original work that had been done by Leslie and Susan and concluded fairly obviously that one of the key areas that intervention is likely to make a difference in is in that young people, the area where they are starting to be excluded. And we started the Apex inclusion model at that time. Today, that's gone from 1 school to 8 schools, and it was with some trepidation and trembling that we invited Leslie along here to talk about the update on the findings, because, of course, the huge danger is that she gets up and says that the findings actually show that what we concluded in those early years is completely wrong, something different has happened. Fortunately, we're in a position to thank her very much for helping us to understand the value of what we're doing and giving us a real sense that the direction that we're trying to work in with this group of young people as they begin to develop habits which are, and relationships which are not positive, not helpful, that is the right way to go. And I'm desperately pleased and thankful to Leslie for giving us that steer, because it gives us encouragement. It tells us that we are moving in the right direction. It's a really great pleasure to thank Leslie for her thought-provoking and reasoned words. I think they've engaged with one of the more difficult aspects of thinking around the future of justice in Scotland at a time when we all need to consider what a more just society might look like. It challenges our whole thoughts of what justice actually is and what we should be doing in terms of moving forward, what sort of Scotland we want to live in, what sort of a society we want to create. If this lecture lives up to the reputation of previous Apex events, I've no doubt that this evening is the start of a significant impact in terms of planning and practice going forward. It's the start of a discourse which I hope will have a real impact on justice thinking in Scotland and community development in Scotland. I've been particularly struck by Leslie's discussion about the othering of offenders and the way we marginalise. And I'm very conscious that recently a number of partner agencies, a number of other major agencies in the justice field have been saying the same sort of thing, that it's time for a new discourse on people who step outside the boundaries of the law. It's time for a change in how we refer to them, in how we think of them, in how we think about what they do and who they are. Because if we continue to marginalise them, we will continue, as she rightly says, to, if you like, reproduce our client group and never actually make any progress. For a while now, Apex has used "so what" as its maxim. It's a maxim which reminds us that we need to be sure what we do and why we do it. And tonight's talk has reinforced our determination to not only innovate, but to clearly understand what we aim to do and why we aim to do it. As we enter into what we know will be a period of change and maybe introspection, we can look forward to the emergence of strategic commissioning, evidence-based practice as an alternative to silo mentalities, traditional sacred cows, and populist perceptions of justice. Community justice is being remodelled in Scotland, and the plans are to genuinely integrate academic research and learning into the planning process. Maybe tonight we've seen a glimpse of the wisdom of this and what can be achieved through that. And potentially it's a marker for how we approach service delivery in the coming years. This has been an excellent night, and I hope you'll join me again in showing your appreciation of our speaker tonight. That was very nearly a standing ovation. I'm impressed. Can I also take the chance tonight, before we go, to thank you for all turning out tonight and engaging so well with the discussion. For your convenience, a video recording of this evening will be available on our new website, together with our latest annual report, which I hope you'll take the time to read. We think it's good. And finally, can I offer my traditional thanks to Lynn and her team, who has always organised things so professionally. They do a sterling job every year, and we really appreciate what they do. They put in quite a stint. And once again, also a big thank you to the Signet Library staff for their helpfulness and their excellent facilities, and to the guys on vision and sound, everything that's helped us allow this evening to go so smoothly. It just remains for me to invite you through to the reception, which will be behind us here. I hope you can enjoy the opportunity to network and carry on the discussions of this evening. If you can't stay, then I wish you a safe home and a very good night. Thank you.